Now, for context, I'm a sole trader, I work in the creative industry, and I'm single and I live in regional Victoria. All four of those reasons made me ineligible for any support, yet I am the one who has been most impacted. The creative industry has been utterly crushed. We're not allowed to work because we're not essential, so apparently my needing to feed myself is not essential, nor is me being able to pay for the roof over my head. I live in regional, therefore I'm not impacted, but my city, which is just 60 kilometers up the road where all of my work is in lockdown, I can't work, but that's okay because I don't live in Melbourne, I live in regional, so therefore no support. I'm a sole trader, so because my business is small, it's insignificant. I would imagine that if anyone were to be impacted by a lockdown, it would be someone who's completely self-reliant. The someone who doesn't get a paycheck from a big government organization. And then add to that, I'm single, there's no support, right? I'm one person. How many people are like me across a state of 6.5 million people? This is lockdown 5 in a so-called pandemic when no one is in ICU. No one is actually sick. I'm not saying that there's not a virus. I am not saying that there are people who would be more susceptible to getting COVID. What I am saying is these precautions, these lockdowns do not warrant the stress, the destruction, the anxiety, and the devastation that it's inflicting on 6.5 million people.
Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
Anybody in this country doesn't minimize their tax. They want their heads ring.
Socialists don't like ordinary people choosing, or they might not choose socialism.
The answer is might, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly. I was saved by God to make America great again.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone who's watching tonight. We're not live on Rumble for some reason. Right before we went live, Rumble decided not to work, or at least the link between StreamYard and Rumble decided not to work. So I'll be uploading that later. But if you are on Facebook or YouTube, you can contribute to tonight's conversation through the chat. And if you're very brave, you can hit that link to StreamYard and call in at any time. We call this Talkback streaming. It's like Talkback radio, but I guess the updated modern version of that. And also thank you to our guest tonight, who's also streaming to her Oddcast platform. So welcome to all the new viewers watching Command the Narrative for the first time. I hope you enjoy it and come along with us as well. Support the Oddcast, because that's a great podcast as well. But let's kick things off, because I want to get into talking to our great guest tonight. And that's by letting you know how you can support us. And it's by heading to commandingthenarrative.com. All the information that we've got is up on commandingthenarrative.com, just like all our former podcasts that we've got there. Also, any articles that I might write in the newsletters that go out, you can find it all there on the website. And also these two surveys. Now, the Shaping the Future of Australia survey, that's been up for a few weeks now. We've had over 3,000 respondents, so that's been really great. And this new one, the Australian Political Parties National Survey. So check that one out if you're interested in maybe letting everyone know your opinion on the current political parties and whether we need a new political party in Australia. Jump on and check that survey out. Surveys are always a lot of fun, so hopefully you find some fun filling out those two surveys. And also, if you want to know who's coming up on the podcast this week, it's all on the website there. And also any upcoming events like this one here, Australians for Better Government's coming to Adelaide. It's on Sunday, October 26th. Now, it's only 2 weeks away, so don't delay. Get your tickets now. It's going to be at 2 p.m. at the Sporting Car Club of South Australia, and we've got some really great speakers. Sarah Game, who's a member of the South Australian Upper House. Michael Arbon, who, I've reached out to a lot of people in South Australia, and I said, who would be a really great speaker for a South Australian event? And everyone said Michael Arbon. He's a political advisor to Senator Ralph Babette. Also, Councillor Henry Davis, who I had on the podcast last week. Very interesting guy with a unique perspective. Mark Neugebauer, who I did his podcast through this week, which I'll mention in a second. And also the main event, Dr. Christopher Reynolds, who I've had on the podcast a lot of times. Everyone loves hearing from Dr. Reynolds. So if you're in Adelaide, please come along to that one. It's only $20 in 2 weeks' time. So we'd love to see you there. ABG is not a political party. It's all about reforming our system of government. So I think that's especially needed in the current situation that we're living in right now. Now, speaking of Mark Neugebauer, I was on his podcast on Friday, Faith, Culture and Politics. So head to his channel and check that one out. We're talking all about Australians for Better Government. As Mark is a committee member of Australians for Better Government. So we had a very, very interesting conversation there. So jump on and support independent media just like Mark is doing. And also, finally, I'll let you know about the Light Australia newspaper. It's got a new edition out now as well. So if you want to be a distributor, head to thelight.australia.com and help get that important information out there as well. So let's get right into it. I've got a very interesting guest with a very interesting story. So let's bring her on right now. Carlz Soda, welcome to Commanding the Narrative.
Hey, thank you for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. Now, I played a little clip of you in the cold open then from way back in the pandemic.
Yeah.
Do you have any flashbacks or anything or traumatic things pop up again?
Look, it's been almost 5 years since I've seen that video. So yeah, it was interesting because I can't even remember what I said. You know, that was a whirlwind experience, that video. But listening to it again, I was like, I made a good point.
No, you definitely did.
It cost me a lot, that video. I mean, look, it went mega viral because I think most people related to it or felt empathy towards people who are in my situation. But, you know, it was a very dangerous time to speak up. And as a consequence, I paid the ultimate price for it. So.
Yeah, but obviously people like yourself, I always say the silver lining of COVID was that a lot of heroes stepped up. Everyday people that weren't political before or didn't have a profile before suddenly had this profile thrust upon them. And I think they're all doing it out of a good place. You know, a lot of people were struggling, but there were a lot of people that struggled behind the scenes that we don't hear their stories. What's the state of Melbourne? I mean, you had a small business there. A lot of small businesses really struggled there. You know, more lockdowns than anywhere else in the world with no real support or accountability from the government either. Have you heard some horror stories from your time, or have people been able to recover somehow?
Oh, look, honestly, Melbourne is a shadow of its former self. And I hate saying that, you know, like I am a proud Melburnian, or I was for a very long time. And I don't like being critical of my city, and I don't like being critical of what's going on here. But, you know, it's getting to a point where I feel like every Melburnian has been touched by either crime or by their small business being hit, or by, you know, the cost of living crisis, getting priced out of housing. It's now at a point where in Melbourne, you know, ideologues are running our government and making incredibly ridiculous decisions at the cost of the majority of people who live here. You know, Jacinta Allen, you know, she wasn't even elected into a position. She got parachuted into it after Dan Andrews stepped down, and she's just carrying on, you know, his government essentially. And there's no transparency. They are basically pushing ahead, spending money that they don't have, plummeting the state into poverty. You know, our credit rating's about to go down again. They're pushing forward with the suburban rail loop, which is a train project that we cannot afford. And it's now getting to a point where, you know, it's not that I want to make fun of it. You have to see the humor in it, because it is getting so bad, and yet people are still so ideologically bound. They're not willing to accept that their team is failing. And the problem with Melbourne is, you know, it's always been a little bit bohemian. It's always been very cultural, and it has always veered a little bit left. But the issue is, because we are now a one-party state, there's no one to hold them accountable. And you just have to walk into the Melbourne CBD and see that, you know, all of the shops are closing down. There's the CBD is empty these days. It's basically just where people go to protest, where a bunch of homeless people hang around. You know, actual Melburnians don't travel into the city, and most people work from home. And now we have a government who's trying to legislate working from home. So, you know, looking at Melbourne, it's not the city I grew up in. It's not the city that I feel like I belong in anymore. And that's why myself and my partner made the decision to leave.
I just assumed after the COVID pandemic, after all the mistakes that the government's made, there'd be some sort of accountability. I mean, even Anthony Albanese was calling for a royal commission, or at least promising a royal commission, and it's never happened. I mean, surprise, surprise. But are you shocked by the lack of accountability when it comes to particularly the Victorian government and how they handled COVID?
Absolutely. I mean, we already have now, what are we, 5 years after the lockdowns? And it was such a tumultuous time. And I think the biggest issue is everyone was hit differently. So people like myself, small businesses, we were hit the worst. We were told we weren't essential. And obviously you've heard plenty of stories of businesses closing down, and they're still trying to crawl back. And now on top of that, you've got a cost of living crisis and tax going through the roof and land tax and things like that. So they've never been able to effectively bounce back from that. But what you also have is the laptop class and the very bloated public service, where people, for the most part during COVID, were quite cushy. They were saving money. They were still getting paid. They were in the comfort of their own home. So there was this real disparity between who was impacted and who was really feeling the impact of COVID. But now moving forward, you look at all the paperwork starting to come out, right? So we've had some freedom of information requests. We've had some information come down from the Human Rights Council of Australia. We've also had some transparency from the police, the Victorian police. And a lot of that decision-making was done on a whim. It wasn't backed by science, like Daniel Andrews told us. So I know you're in Sydney, so I don't want to bore you with too much Melbourne stuff, but our health officer, Brett Sutton, was the one who famously implemented a curfew at 9 p.m, the 5K radius, you can't shake hands, the whole 1 meter apart kind of stuff. And now all these years later, he's been doing the podcast circuit himself, and he's freely admitting that he made those decisions because it sounded like a good idea, not because it was based in anything factual. And as we know, a lot of those decisions cause catastrophic issues for a lot of people. It made it very difficult for parents who were separated to manage their children. It made families being torn apart for multiple lockdowns. And so now when you see all the devastation and you see Melbourne starting to hollow out, we know who enacted those laws. We know who instigated a lot of this ideological policy making that wasn't backed by any real reason or any real research. And now, as I've said, the problem is Labor has been in control in Victoria for so long, they don't care. They'll openly lie to your face. And that, that's being seen right now when it comes to youth crime. And if that's something you want to talk about, I'll happily chat to that. But they're gaslighting you to your face. They know what they're doing is wrong. They know what they're doing doesn't make sense, and they don't care. And the issue is most Aussies, and I don't try to, bring down Aussies, but unfortunately, I think the reason we are in this position is because we're not willing to call a spade a spade. Most Aussies are politically apathetic, and most Aussies, unfortunately, don't really care about things until it's impacting themselves personally. So whereas, across the aisle, you might be seeing someone having a hard time, particularly during COVID, right? Most people didn't speak up because, well, it's not my business. It's not my place. I don't want to do that. In Australia, we have a really terrible case of tall poppy syndrome, which I think, deters a lot of people from speaking up. But now with the government openly and outwardly saying to us like, oh, this is not a problem. Youth crime's not a problem. Whilst, someone's been murdered by a machete, but they'll come out and say, our machete bins are working. And, Melburnians or Victorians are just sitting there going, okay, I guess we'll just cop that too. So when you say a lack of accountability, what we really need to look at is why are so few Aussies willing to really put their face to their voice and speak up? I know a lot of people like to do it clandestinely. A lot of people like to sort of, have a bit of a chat behind closed doors. But, for the most part, we have to look at each other and go, why are we so willing to just cop this?
Do you think a big problem was that I think there was a big divide during COVID? Obviously, I go to a lot of political events since then, and everyone that's become active since that time was affected in some way. They lost their job, or they weren't able to see a family member that was dying, or whatever it might have been. There's something that government actually touched them and affected their lives. Whereas on the flip side, a lot of people, it was the biggest holiday they ever had. You know, suddenly they got to stay at home and go surfing all day and get paid for it. Or now they've been working from home ever since, and they think, oh, well, COVID was great because it brought in this new policy of working from home. So I think a lot of people out there, and I talk to them at work, you know, they say, oh, COVID was the best holiday they ever had. Do you think that's part of the problem?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think, you know, when I put that video out, it was lockdown 5, and it was one of those snap lockdowns, which, you know, at 8 p.m., you know, we're all going to lockdown. So you don't have a lot of time to get yourself organized. And what that meant for a lot of small businesses is that they're constantly trying to plan and trying to figure out what their next move was. And it got to a point where in Victoria, if you weren't watching the daily press releases, you didn't know what you were allowed to do and what you weren't allowed to do. It got so ridiculous. Oh, you know, you can do this at this point, but if you do that and then you do this together, then that's illegal. You know, it was a total pantomime. And I think Daniel Andrews honestly was just enjoying his little chance to be a dictator. But, you know, moving across and having a look what's going on, Aussies are following downstream for what's going on in the US. We're becoming incredibly partisan. You know, people are incredibly the discrepancy between left and the right, or, you know, right, wrong, whatever you want to call it, you know, to make it easy, we'll talk about left and right. People are so willing to stand by their ideological views that they're not willing to sort of enter into that center ground and have the common sense discussion. And that's a lot of what's happening here. So, you know, even if you look at the chats, whether it's on this stream or the Oddcast or any YouTube video where people are sort of talking about culture or politics, it's now about point scoring. It's about saying, well, my team's winning, so look at this, this, and this. But, you know, the most unfortunate thing is we're not willing to have a conversation and go, well, look, I agree with what my team's doing, but I can acknowledge that this here isn't quite working out, and maybe that needs our attention. And this is very much sort of imported politics from America. Pick a side and you die by that side, right? And that's certainly happening in Victoria. We are very left-leaning in certain parts. Certainly in more rural areas, it's much more conservative or centrist. But the loudest minority gets all the airtime because, you know, they are that squeaky wheel demanding attention. And we're seeing that a lot with whether it's the pro-Palestine movement or the LGBT. These people keep getting their way because they're the ones causing all the chaos and destruction. Whereas your more common sense Aussies, your general small business owners, or the people who are just working their day to day and trying to raise their families and live their lives, they're either distracted by their lives and not particularly focused on what's going on, or they're living in a bubble. You know, there's a lot of people who are still quite wealthy and they're not really feeling a lot of these the flow and effects from these policies. So why would they step into it, you know?
Look, one of the things that's really surprised me in researching for this interview tonight is the crime that's happening down in Melbourne, and we were talking about a little bit off air about whether we're seeing it here in Sydney. Well, I'm sure it's happening. We've always had crime, particularly out in Western Sydney. There's pockets where, you know, that you might not go, but generally I feel pretty safe in Sydney. I was up in Queensland recently on the Gold Coast, and people were telling me, "Oh, don't go that area. You know, we'll give you a lift. Don't walk 10 minutes down the street because you know, it's quite dangerous." And that really shocked me. But these figures that are coming out of Melbourne really blew me away. And this article, it comes up with a lot of figures from CBD News here, and it says crime surge hits Melbourne. Thefts from cars and retail stores drive statewide increase, and it goes through this analysis and statistics that have come out from the Crime Statistics Agency. Figures for the 12 months to June 2025 show 638,000 criminal offences across Victoria, an increase of over 15% from the previous year. Theft from motor vehicles remains the most common offence across the state, rising nearly 40%. Retail theft also continues to escalate across Victoria in the past year, up 27.6%. Motor vehicle thefts rose to the highest level since 2002, with a 42% jump. And police intelligence indicates that almost 11,000 edged weapons were seized statewide over the past year. I mean, these are incredible figures. Do you have any idea why the crime is surging in Victoria? I mean, there has to be a reason.
How long have you got? Yeah, look, absolutely it is. This is again just ideology gone mad. So essentially, the mandate from the government is to go easy on crime. So, this is a particularly delicate issue for some people because regardless what you say, you're going to be branded a racist. Firstly, we need to look at who's committing the crime. And a lot of it is, unfortunately, committed by migrant children. Now, the first thing people say is when you say the word migrant or dare to even touch on the word immigration, people instantly brand you as a racist. Well, we need to look at who's actually committing the crime. Then we can look at how to solve it. So a lot of this is Sudanese, and it started out over 10 years ago. Now, famously, Daniel Andrews went toe-to-toe with Peter Dutton on this when Peter Dutton dared to talk about the Apex gang crime. And Apex was a Sudanese crime or South Sudanese crime. It was done mostly by youths in Victoria, and it was, to be fair, mostly out in the western suburbs. But what's happened, and particularly now with this progressive ideology that's really started to invade both our judicial system, our criminal justice system, obviously our politics, obviously culture at large, is that now we have to tiptoe around all these issues. And so what was, for the most part, quite a small problem in a western suburb has been able to grow and manifest across the state at large. And so now what you have in today's, in October, we have over 1,100 repeat offenders who are repeatedly arrested and bailed due to the mandate from the Victorian government. So even just this past week, Jacinta Allen came out about 3-4 months ago saying that Victoria was going to have the toughest bail laws in the country. And just a week ago, they've revised their mandate for our magistrates, which says to deter the magistrates from jailing these kids at all cost. So what this does is sets a precedent for these kids. You can do whatever you want. You're never going to be held accountable. And so now what you have is kids as young as 12 being murdered by another child at 14 by a machete. That's where we're at in Victoria. Now, as someone who's in Victoria, obviously I'm seeing this all day, every day. I'm not too sure how it's been reported the rest of the nation, but every day we are hearing either about a home invasion where it's kids, right? These are all kids under 18, not all, but most of them, breaking into homes. They're stabbing people, they're maiming them, they're amputating their arms with machetes over an iPhone. They're stealing cars. They're driving around suburban roads at 100 kilometers an hour, smashing into trees and either killing each other or killing other people. This is every night. This is not like a once in a lifetime kind of thing. This is everyday repeated offenses. And on top of that, even more scary is we now have carjackings in Victoria. We have 9 carjackings in Victoria a week. That is these kids holding up people, getting into their cars and stealing their cars. There was a story about a month ago of a young mum who had already put 2 of her kids into the car and she went back to grab the 3rd one. And 2 youth offenders came by, stole the car with the 2 children in the back seat. And they dumped the kids about 2 streets away and then continued on to steal the car, and they used that car in crime. And then just last week in Burke Street, kids, again, joyriding in a stolen BMW in the middle of Burke Street, which is our big mall. It's kind of like your George Street, I think. And they're just driving around causing chaos. Literally yesterday in Broadmeadows, which is a western suburbs shopping centre, you have 2 teenagers fighting each other with machetes. So it's not just a small amount of people. It's now daily. This is what Victorians are living with. And if you dare to sort of intervene or to say the unspoken thing, which is a lot of this is being caused by the same kids who happen to be migrants, you're branded a racist, and that just shuts down the conversation.
Yeah, no, it's scary stuff. I mean, the government really has to get a handle on this. The fact that they're going easy on this sort of crime is scary, in my opinion. You mentioned the opposition and there being a lack of opposition. Is there anyone speaking out against this? Because surely there needs to be people rising up and saying, look, this is not on. We can't have this anymore.
Look, there is, but my frustration with the Liberal Party is they're completely lost. They don't know who they are or what they stand for. They are nowhere near what Robert Menzies founded the Liberal Party on. And look, I'm not a massive Liberal voter myself. I have some issues with their policies as well. But for the most part, the way a government's meant to work is you sort of go between the two and you find somewhere in the middle. In Victoria, that's not the case. We've had a mostly Labor government for almost 20 years. But when you look at this crime and when you look at what's going on, what it needs is like radical accountability and people going, okay, there's a problem here. We need to speak up. But I'll give you an example of Jacinta Allen and just how good she gaslights the Victorian public. We had an unfortunate scenario about 2 weeks ago where an Indigenous boy was murdered. He was stabbed to death. Now, it wasn't a machete this time. It was just a really long chef's knife, and he was stabbed and he bled out on the street. Now, in fronting the press, I kid you not, Jacinta Allen's first words were, well, we know the machete bins are working because we've had over 6,000 knives handed in. But it's unfortunate that this child has been murdered, right? That's the kind of rhetoric that comes from our government. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this story, but the Victorian government spent $13 million on this initiative to implement machete bins. Now, of those machete bins, I think there's about 40 littered around different police stations under the proviso that these youth offenders are going to voluntarily hand in their weapons. And because they've now outlawed machetes, if you have one in your garden shed for, controlling your garden, or if you use one for hiking, you yourself are now branded a criminal. So obviously all the good people are coming forward and disposing of their weapons, and the youths and the criminals are keeping them to carry out these attacks. And so when we look at the Liberal Party and their approach to this is, Brad Batten, who's our Liberal leader down here, he's an ex-police member. So, you would think someone like that would be willing to go out there and really, beat the drum about this. He's doing it from a very, very milquetoast way. He's doing it in a way that's sort of tiptoeing around the issue. And the problem with Australians, and I think a lot of this is because of the woke progressive movement, cancel culture, being afraid to say the right thing, is we're not actually having the required conversation here. It's like, oh, it's not good. That's not good. No, let's have the conversation. These are kids from the western suburbs who are repeatedly bailed. Why? Because they're either Indigenous or because they're South Sudanese. And if we were to put them in jail, that would be a very bad look for the government. That's why they're not doing it. The government is too worried about the perception of Victorians for jailing these youth offenders. And so what happens is they gain confidence and they continually go out there and repeat the same crimes. And so now with the Liberal government, they already have no leg to stand on. They're so weak. They're too scared to say the obvious thing because they feel like, there's going to be backlash for saying it. So the people who are speaking up the most are people like myself, people who have been impacted by it. So we were victims of a home invasion last year. They broke in, they stole our car, and it was teenagers, right? They ransacked the home and stole a bunch of stuff. And so that's what made me become really vocal, because ever since I haven't felt safe, and we actually left that house because we just felt really vulnerable there. And so we've taken all these precautions to fortify our home. And you're seeing that a lot with a lot of Victorians now. All Victorians are going, well, I need to get security cameras. I need to put bolts in my garage door. I need to make sure that, these kids can't get into our house to steal our car. And our government and our leaders are just tiptoeing around the issue. I'll give you one more example. Georgie Purcell, who's a representative from the Animal Justice Party, she is campaigning on the fact that bail saves lives, and she's doing it from this suicidal empathy point of view. Her view is that by putting these youth offenders in jail, it's going to basically create hardened criminals. And so through her compassionate approach, she doesn't want these kids put in remand or juvie. Now, what that means is people like the Indigenous child that I just mentioned get murdered by other children. And a month ago, I'm not too sure if you heard this story, we had 2 Sudanese children murdered, maimed by a machete. And unfortunately, that footage went viral on X. It was a 12-year-old boy and a 14-year-old boy walking home from a basketball game, and a rival gang over a meme slashed them to death by a machete. That's what's happening in Victoria. But we can't have that conversation.
Yeah, it's just terrible, and the fact that the government's not doing anything about it, and the fact that there's no opposition. I mean, I don't see this going in the right direction. I mean, I've got this article here about Peter Ford. Now, I'm not really familiar who Peter Ford is. He's a media personality down in Melbourne. He's saying that he's going to be leaving the state after 5 break-ins. And I guess a similar situation to your situation that you spoke of as well. I mean, we're almost seeing a repeat of COVID, where there was this mass exodus from Melbourne and Victoria to other states because they just didn't feel, I guess they didn't feel safe during COVID because of the government, but now they're not feeling safe because of all this crime. I mean, it's a really sorry state for a place that used to be very well regarded. I mean, I think a lot of people, love Melbourne. I like going down to Melbourne. I mean, I haven't been down there since COVID, but it was a great place to go. Has a lot of culture and great nightlife and everything that comes along with that. Great sport. I mean, it's a really great city to live in, but it sounds like it's just heading in the complete wrong direction. Are you hearing about people packing up and leaving the city and getting out?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the first people that are leaving are the business owners and the people with means.
And
Myself
they're the
and my
ones that are
partner,
going to hold things together. I mean, they're the ones that employ
yeah,
people and keep everything going.
absolutely. And I mean, it's just a common sense discussion. If they leave, sorry, or they're deterred and they leave Victoria, well, what's going to be left? And the unfortunate thing is this pervasive reignition of socialism in the youth, right? So in Victoria, there is a very, very strong contingent of youths who have embraced socialism. And whether it's people like Purple Pingers, I'm not sure if you're familiar with who he is, or it's Abby Chatfield, there's a lot of these influential or influencers, I guess you could call them, who are really enamoring the youth around socialism. And a lot of this is coming down to, they look at late stage capitalism and they blame all the wealthy people or the business owners for harboring all the wealth. And they're the reason that they can't get into homes. And this messaging has been incredibly damaging. And so when you look at a lot of the business owners in Melbourne, aside from whether it's land tax or different legislation that's been enacted to tax them further, there's no reason to have a business in Victoria anymore. And Jacinta Allen is now campaigning on trying to legislate working from home, which, if you're a business owner, why would you employ anyone? What's the incentive anymore? So I've seen countless people leave. I mean, during COVID, so many people fled up to Queensland. But now, nearly every person I speak to is saying, yeah, look, we're making plans. And not just leaving Melbourne, by the way. I think a lot of people are really worried about the direction Melbourne's heading. And that might sound like hyperbole, but you've got to look at what the Albanese government's doing and sort of look around and go, well, it doesn't sound like the Australian government's for the Australian people. It sounds like the Australian government is sort of more caring about globalist agendas or ensuring that, their backers are looked after. And, whether it's the housing crisis, whether it's youth crime, cost of living, everyone's feeling it. And so that de-incentivizes people from working. It stops people from being productive. Why would you want to start a business in Victoria? It's completely decimated our hospitality industry, which is what Melbourne was known for. And you walk around some of the most beautiful shopping districts in Melbourne, whether it's, Chapel Street, Bridge Road, all of these places are just empty. Shop after shop is for lease. And that just speaks to how deterred people are from having a business in Melbourne. And as a consequence, the community suffers.
Look, it's so hard operating a small business. I mean, you would know that operating your own. I mean, I've got a friend, Adam Zara, who's just started a small business and he's working 20 hours a day and 7 days a week, just trying to get by. It's not easy starting a small business. And I mean, you have these people on the left, like Purple Pingers that you mentioned, and Abby Chatfield, who are pushing these socialist views. I mean, what have they created in their lives to employ people and build a business that supports the community and everything that comes along with that? Small business is vital. And I mean, I grew up in the John Howard era, and he was always talking about small business and supporting small business. It's almost like it's something that's not talked about anymore. I mean, I can't point to any politician that talks about small business these days, and I can't think of any policies that have come along to support small business. I mean, how hard is it for you to operate a small business, not just in Melbourne, Victoria, but across Australia currently?
Oh, look, it's incredibly challenging. I mean, whether it's government policies, whether it's higher tax and just deterring you from and trying to start a business, there's also a real boot on our necks regarding innovation. You think of all the red tape and all the government protocols and all the hoops that you have to jump through to get special permission to do, whatever it might be. You want to build something in your backyard? Yep, you got to go get a permit from the council. That's going to take you 18 months. You want to do that? Yep, you got to get permission from this government body and this government body. So the government makes it hard. But I also want to bring in another concept, which is tall poppy. And this is this learned apathy around Australians that when we look at someone else doing well, we get really salty about it. And I'll give you an example. This is someone I've brought up quite a lot on our podcast, and that's Adrian Patelli. So are you familiar with Adrian?
No, I haven't heard of him, no.
Okay, so Adrian's a Melbourne born and bred entrepreneur who's now become a billionaire. And he's the guy that famously lifted his McLaren Centre up into an apartment complex as it's been built in Melbourne. So quite showy, right? And he has an online lottery where you go in the draw to win homes and cars. And, he's created a huge amount of wealth out of this. And I would say, I look at someone like Adrian and I go, he's playing the game beautifully. He understands marketing. He understands that the attention is the greatest commodity that we have at the moment. And he's just playing that game really well. And as a result, he's become incredibly successful. Now, he was also on the block and he went and bought all the block houses. So, he's been riding that publicity really well. But when you go and have a look in any comment thread where Adrian Patelli is mentioned, you have a look at just how angry the average Aussie is that someone's doing well for themselves. Well, I'm struggling, therefore Adrian must be a bad guy. We've got one in the comments. It's just calling me or Topher a grifter. We don't like to see people do well in this country. We look at other people's success and it makes us mad as opposed to inspire us. And that's really interesting because if you go look in America, and a lot of my friends are American, they champion success. Not all, of course, but for the most part. It's a very entrepreneurial country. And they have, the great American dream. Success, go and build some wealth for yourself and retire and build a big home. Whereas in Australia, if you work really hard, people laugh at you. If you're someone that builds something up, we take the piss out of you because, oh, you're putting yourself out there. You might look like a bit of a twat. You might say the wrong thing. You might be giving it a crack. And so we go out of our way to try and push that person back down. But when they manage to, break free from that and they do really well, it's Aussies' jobs to then remind them where they came from and pull them back down. So that's that tall poppy syndrome I was talking about. So you've got both things happening at the same time. You've got the government deterring people from having a small business, but then you've got the Australian people who get really angry when other people reach success. And so what's the incentive? This is why so many people go overseas. This is why so many musicians, actresses, entrepreneurs, they all go abroad.
What do you think that is? I mean, I never really believed in the tall poppy syndrome until I got into politics, and it's only really been in recent years. I'm like, oh wow, like this is actually a thing. Like people just, I guess I don't know I don't know why it's inbred in our culture. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know what it's about or why people feel that way. But it really, people find it hard to support anyone that does anything in this country. And we really need to get behind people and bring them up. And you can't just do it on your own. You need people to support you. But I mean, it does exist. It's not just something that's just a term that's thrown around. Oh, the tall poppy syndrome. And actually, it's a thing. I don't know. I don't understand why it's in our culture. It just doesn't seem to make any sense to me. Do you have any idea, like, or feelings as to why?
I think it's a learned behavior. And look, so just for reference, I actually didn't grow up in Australia. I grew up abroad. So I grew up in Japan and I was surrounded by expats. So I when I moved back to Australia and went to school here, I noticed it very quickly. I was only young, but I immediately felt like alien. There was this culture here of footy, netball, and, you sort of, everyone did the same thing. And if you did anything different, you were weird, right? And that's obviously a very childish way of viewing it. But as I got older, I realized that for the most part, and again, look, this is a generalization, but for the most part, Australians don't like doing things outside of whatever that is their accepted norm. And there's a whole sort of group think that I think is really bred into our culture. And that is, this is the way we do things. This is the way we've always done them. And if you don't do it this way, you're weird. And we see that kind of groupthink now on the left, for example. So when we have a look at the woke movement, they have such a narrow definition of the way you should be. You know, you've got to be inclusive, you've got to appreciate diversity, you've got to speak a certain way. And the second you accidentally misstep out of it, whether it's deliberate or accidental, you're absolutely pulled over the coals for it. I don't know why that is. I would love to understand, but I do think a lot of it comes down to scarcity. Whereas, you know, if you see someone else doing something different and they're able to achieve wealth, for example, like with Adrian, people seem to believe that means there's less available from them. I think that's part of it. And the other side of it is, I think it also serves as a bit of a mirror. If someone else is working a little bit harder and achieving more, it makes you realize where you're falling short. And I think, you know, it can make people really uncomfortable because they realize, oh, yeah, I'm not really putting in that effort, you know?
Well, I guess we've got that laid back mentality as well. So maybe they could go hand in hand. People just want to sit on the beach or sit at the pub and live in paradise. Whereas if you have a go-getter that goes out there and really strives for something, you're kind of looking at them going, why don't you just want to relax, mate, and just take it easy? Whereas I feel America's completely different to that. I mean, they really want to support people and encourage people to succeed. And I think we should as well. I think we really need to change that culture and support as many people as we can, because this country has a lot of potential. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can achieve. I mean, someone told me the other day that Queensland is the size of Europe or larger. And to think about the development that hasn't even gone on yet, like we haven't even started to develop that part of the country yet. So there's so many great things that we could do here. But to think about the current political situation, we're going to be so held back, particularly by the debt. I mean, the figure at the moment is $167 billion that the Victorian government's in debt. That's not to mention the $1 trillion that the federal government's in debt. I mean, that's intergenerational theft from future generations. They're going to be paying that off. Your kids, my kids, the grandkids. I mean, how are they going to get by? How are the state governments around the country going to be able to build the roads that require, the dams, the hospitals, the new schools? I mean, we are really behind the eight ball because all this money that's been spent in the last few years on COVID and other stupid things, and we have nothing to show for it. We have nothing at all. And we are really, I don't think people realize the trouble that this country's in, particularly when you just focus on the amount of debt that we're in. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, financial literacy in this country is lacking at the best of times. We're a country that's grown up on the never, never. You know, how many Australians have an Afterpay, a Klarna, a Hum account, as well as credit cards, as well as a mortgage and then car payments, right? They call us the lucky country. And I think a lot of people see that as a positive thing. It was actually meant as a negative. The problem is so few Aussies have ever faced hardship that they think that it can't get bad. This is, you know, it's Australia. Things like that don't happen here. And when we talk about the debt that the government has put both the states in and the nation itself, this is done. These decisions and these policies are being implemented by people who've never had a real job. These are people who got into these movements, whether in the union or in the Young Labor Party, and have basically ridden that public service coattail up until they get these positions. These aren't people who have gotten to those positions out of merit or because of intelligence or because of their own success. They're good at playing the political game. They're good at backstabbing and making deals so that they eventually get to the prime ministership. And, you know, if I look at Victoria, because I'm not particularly well versed in what's going on, say, New South Wales, but you look at our spending, a lot of this was done for major infrastructure projects, right? So we've got a bunch of new highways that were being built. And the problem is, firstly, it goes out to tender and they all underquote so that they can then get the job. And then, of course, the union gets involved. And then what you have is a whole bunch of muscle trying to push people around, and the project itself gets completely bloated out of proportion. And here we are 5-6 years later, it's still not done. It's over budget by 200-300%. And we find out that the CFMEU was the one that was doing a lot of I'm going to be careful what I say. Allegedly were doing naughty things on their work sites, and the government knew about it. So again, I come back to that gaslighting. This was well known. It was documented, but the government pretends it doesn't know until it all comes out, right? So when you look at this, you've got people making decisions about money that's not theirs, right? This is taxpayer funds. It's not coming out of their bank account. And they're not going to be the ones that have to worry about the debt in 20 years' time, because they're all going to retire with their very cushy government salaries. Some of them get pensions, some of them don't. But as we've seen with Daniel Andrews, I'm sure you saw this, they're already teeing up their jobs after politics. And the problem with politics in Victoria and Australia is that's not the end goal. That's the jumping off point. Someone like Daniel Andrews, someone like Kevin Rudd, they had global ambition. Kevin Rudd tried to go for, what was it, Secretary of the UN? And Daniel Andrews is over in China, literally standing with Kim Jong-un and Putin. And he's standing there in a group photo with these people. So, like, you know, Daniel Andrews, during his premiership, he went over to China multiple times and never invited the press. Why? Because he was teeing up his career after politics. And so that's the problem. A lot of our politicians aren't in politics to, you know, look after Australia or to make better decisions for Australians at large. They're doing it for self-serving purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I think people like us, we can see it happening and we try and talk about it and expose it. But I think for a lot of people, there's a flow-on effect. And it might take, 5 years for these things to really play out and start impacting people. But I think the chickens are really starting to come home to roost, particularly on the economy. I mean, we've been blessed in this country for a long time, decades, that whenever there was a financial thing that happened overseas, we somehow seem to bear the brunt of it and kick on and not really miss a beat. But this latest data out by the OECD, it's showing that Australia's fall in disposable income is the worst in the world.
Yeah,
we've just, I guess you could say, broken a world record. And you can look at this chart here. This is the real gross household disposable income per capita, and you can see Australia in the red. We've just dropped off the cliff ever since COVID. Dropped off the cliff, while the rest of the world are moving forward. I mean, they're recovering after COVID. They seem to have picked up the pieces and gone on, where Australia is really paying the price. You can see from more charts here. I mean, look, you can see all the OECD countries have kicked on, but we are going backwards. And it comes down to poor leadership and poor government, in my view.
Yeah.
And people like yourself, people like me, and others have been talking about this for a lot of years now. I think people are going to have to start paying attention to this, because this is your hip pocket, people. The reason why you're struggling at the moment, you maybe can't pay the rent and you can't pay the groceries. I mean, this is the impact of excessive spending from government and no real clear economic policies that are going to bring benefit to the people. And at the same time, they're bringing hordes of people in from overseas, when obviously we're going backwards economically. You think you want to look after Australian people first. So what are your thoughts where you see graphs like that and you see that we're leading the world in decline?
It makes me really sad. First things first, I'm a proud Aussie, and I don't like, sitting here and speaking poorly of my country. But I see that, and this might offend some people, is we're getting what we voted for. This is what we deserve. And unfortunately, that apathy and that unwillingness to speak up and to sort of put yourself above the pulpit to speak about these bad decisions is why we're now facing these consequences. I don't think there's a home in this country that's not facing some kind of cost of living crisis in their home, whether it's their bloated utility bills or it's all the taxes they're now paying. I think everyone is starting to notice, yet so few people are still willing to acknowledge why this is happening. When you look at that graph and you understand why our economy starts to matter, you have to look back to COVID and the rhetoric that was being put out by either the media or the governments of the day. And that was, we need to save lives. The economy doesn't matter. Well, here we are with very obvious proof that the economy does matter. And we really need to care about productivity of the country as a whole. And this isn't just down to individuals like you and me working. This is also about the way the government of the day is legislating policy around what we're doing with all our exports, about what we're doing with our immigration. There are so many failures here. And, it's frustrating because, like, we've got a whole generation coming up under us who have been completely brainwashed by socialism. And I feel, and unfortunately, I feel like this is the case, we're going to go down the road of Venezuela. We are going to start facing actual socialism. We are going to start seeing the government stepping in, taking control of certain things, putting in price freezes, whether it's of groceries. And that's a very dangerous way to be. But scarily, you go and look at the comment section again, whether it's over YouTube or in social media, Aussies are cheering for this, particularly the young ones. And the scary part is that Gen Z are a huge portion of the voter base now. And so you and I look at that graph and go, this is terrifying. For the young generation, they look at capitalism as the enemy, and it needs to be dismantled. So, I think there's so many issues here, and I don't know which one you start with. I think the first one is get these useless leaders out of Parliament. But
Yep.
I think what it's going to require is engaging in discussions like this. I think for the most part, Aussies for a really long time didn't have these kind of conversations because we didn't need to. There was that old adage about don't talk about religion, politics, or money. I think now that's exactly what we need to talk about. And that's why I'm hopeful conversations like this, whether people feel confident to have those conversations with their family or with their colleagues, at least they're privy to ones between, say, you or me and Topher or whoever, it start to make them feel a little bit more engaged. But I genuinely have fears for Australia. I don't want to be, all doom and gloom about it, but judging by the youth, I think we're in for a couple more hard years yet.
No, I think so too. And there was a poll that came out by Redbridge just today, I think it was, that was showing that the skew of young voters was, I think, about 60 to 70% towards Labor and the Greens. So they're supporting this. They're supporting these policies. They're supporting governments like the Victorian Labor government and the federal Labor government. And they think that they're doing a good job. And I guess that leads me to my next question. And I want to talk about the woke agenda. And maybe that has maybe taken our eye off the ball. I remember a few years ago, I was speaking to an Indian gentleman. He said one of the things that really blew him away coming here to Australia is that we're so focused on the transgender issues and the LGBTQ issues and all that sort of stuff. Meanwhile, in India, they're sending rockets into space and putting them on the moon and all these amazing things. And he said, our focus here in this country has gone completely off the ball. And I think this, these economic figures show that. We haven't been talking about the economy. We haven't been talking about the debt. We haven't been talking about housing affordability. We're starting to talk about immigration now. I think that's becoming a hot topic. But our eyes really been off the ball in recent years. I mean, we're talking about climate change and all this sort of stuff. These distractions that at the end of the day don't really mean anything, but the consequence is the important issues. Small business, again, the support of small business, that's been neglected. Our eye has come off the ball, and now we're finding ourselves in big trouble. I mean, how do you feel about that statement?
Yeah, look, I agree with you. I mean, the climate change one is a big one. Australia as a population and as a country, our percentage of carbon footprint is insignificant in comparison to, say, China or India. And yet our government's willing to throw it all away and implement all of these green energy policies at the detriment of you and me and our utility bills. There's not a household in this country who haven't seen either their electricity or their gas bills go through the roof. And this is all because of the pursuit of net zero and implementing all these unreliable green technologies. Whereas over in China, they're importing our coal, they're importing our iron ore, and they're building with it. They're not worried about climate change. They're not worried about the climate. And, between India and China, they have half the population of the globe or thereabouts, right? And these guys are not hesitating to build and to innovate and to grow. And then Western countries that are very wealthy, like Australia, are just declining. I think a lot of this, I mean, look, not to get conspiratorial, but a lot of this is to do with Marxist agenda that's been implemented in schools. This is a long game for Marxists. They've completely weaponized the education system, which is why our young ones are so enamored with socialism. They look at capitalism, again, like as a bad thing, whereas you look at everyone who's doing it tough in Australia, what they need is opportunity. And the Australian government and its policies completely discourages any of those opportunities and also puts the boot down on anyone who's trying to do something different. So, when you look at the decline that we're facing, I think that unfortunately, this is what Australians deserve. That's a horrible statement to make. I know that. But this is a result of people not being politically aware, of not paying attention, and sort of also being really, I've got to manage my words, really uninterested in what's going on globally as well. Because for the most part, everyone's been unaffected until now. Maybe we need to taste it. I don't know. It's a horrible thing to say, but
Look, I speak to a lot of people in the UK, and they remark
UK's terrible.
that the issues that we're facing here in Australia are almost identical to the issues that are being faced in the UK, and in some ways they're a little bit further along than we are. But you look at countries like UK, you look at America, you look at Canada, New Zealand, we're facing similar issues and similar styles of leadership and poor leadership as well. Do you think that plays into the idea of this managed decline of the West? Whereas there's something going on behind the scenes where you almost, there's forces out there that want the West to fall.
I think so too. And it's, again, that suicidal empathy where we've been conditioned to resent ourselves and to hate ourselves and not to be proud, There's all this conversation around whiteness is a bad thing. And I mean, a lot of that stems from American ideology, this discussion around, colonialism and white privilege. But that's what we're thinking about, whilst everyone else in the rest of the world, whether it's Russia, China, India, are focusing on what they can do for their future. How can they build? How can they, unfortunately, how can they start to really take up their position as superpowers? And you've got people like the US who are still trying to figure out what genders they are. And they've got children who are more concerned about their sexual orientation and their own genitalia than they are about their futures. This is all very deliberate. And the civil unrest as a consequence is quite concerning. People throw around the word civil war quite loosely, but unfortunately, if things don't start turning around, that's where it's going to get to. And that doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to pick up bayonets and pitchforks, but civil war in a sense of we'll be so divided, it will be impossible to get anything done. We'll be basically in a headlock with our opposition. And, whether you look at what's going in the UK, I'd say they're probably about 5-10 years in front of us, particularly around the immigration. They've had a huge influx of fundamental Islamists who are now taking up positions in their local councils and in their local political areas, and they're implementing policies where they can legislate that they want Sharia law. And then you've got issues like the Pakistani rape gangs, which was completely thrown under the carpet because we didn't want to talk about the fact that they were Pakistani. So a lot of these things, when you start to put it all together, this looks very deliberate. And, to be conspiratorial, people talk about WEF all the time, Agenda 2030, all those things. And I do think there's an element of truth there. I think it's a lean towards globalization and the concentration of power amongst a political elite. But what happens from here, it really relies on the people, the average person, to start becoming quite aware and focused on these things. Because, as I said, Australians by nature are quite apathetic, which is why they're able to get as far as they did.
Yeah, no, you're right. Look, it's been really great talking to you tonight. It's great to hear your perspective. Unfortunately, we've had to talk about a lot of depressing issues.
It's unfortunate the way it is.
There's not too many bright lights, but maybe one of the bright lights I just want to ask you on, and look, your audience is going to know all about this, but just for my audience, I'm sure there's a lot of crossover as well, but you're doing this Oddcast with Topher Field. Tell us a little bit about the podcast and tell me a little bit about Topher, because I had him on the podcast probably well over a year ago now, and he really blew me away. I feel that this man's a real thought leader in this country, and I was very impressed by when he appeared on Commanding the Narrative. So give us a bit of insight on the Oddcast and your relationship with Topher.
Yeah, so Topher and I met during COVID, actually. He was one of the first people to start becoming really loud around what was going on. And, I was doing it more from a perspective of small business. Topher was doing it more from a perspective of libertarianism. And, when that video that you played at the beginning of this podcast went viral, what came afterwards was a very swift takedown of myself. And Topher reached out to me and sort of was one of the few people that was able to help me navigate that time, which was really, really, really challenging. And we ended up having lots of good chats. And one day we just said, we should do this on an Instagram Live because these chats are really in depth and interesting and fun. And, I spoke before about engaging Australians who want to talk about politics. And I think forums like this are what we need. And so, not to steal the old project's tagline, but it's the news delivered differently. It's the kind of conversations that you should be able to have either with your colleagues or your family that maybe we don't feel comfortable to. So what we do is essentially pull up the news of the week. We start local and then we zoom out to global, and we just sort of unpack the articles, talk about things. And look, Topher is a ideological-led libertarian. He's freedom first, and that is, everything that sort of underpins his commentary around politics. He's been a political commentator for almost 20 years. So he's right across all the policy, all the legislation. And myself, I'm a culture person. So being in the arts industry, I look at what's happening from culture. And as they say, politics runs downstream from culture. And so the two of us come together and we have some chats. We have a big laugh. And look, when it comes to these conversations, as you and I know tonight, they can be really heavy, which I think is a lot of the reason why people try not to talk about them, because it can leave you feeling a little bit depressed and a little bit like, what's the point? I can't achieve anything. With the Oddcast, we're trying to encourage people to have those conversations and bring a bit of lightness to it as well. Like, we're certainly not professional. You're not going to see us reading like newsreaders. But, I think it's really important in Australia that we get a lot more independent media, and as much as we can encourage each other and help each other. So, whether it's crossovers on podcasts like this, I think that's a really important thing, because again, another generalizing statement, I think Australians are notorious for not sending the ladder back down either. So once someone starts to see a little bit of success, you'll rarely see them want to help the next generation up. But, when you look over across into the US, you've got so many huge independent media companies who have been able to build really, really big businesses based on the same thing that you and I are doing here. And whether that's the Daily Wire or it could be Timcast, and there's obviously some Democrat run ones as well that I just not interested in. But, I think that's really important, that the more we can have conversations amongst people like us who are in the community every day, who run businesses, who are representative of the Australian population, the better.
Yeah. No, I agree completely. I've been saying that for a long time. Just look to America and the success that they've had there. And it's not that tall poppy syndrome over there. Each podcaster supports the other, and they have them on their shows and they promote them. And there's a real sense of networking and lifting everyone up. There's that saying, all ships rise with rising tides, or whatever that saying is. But I think that's the case. And we've had some great people on this show and supported them, and in turn they've supported us. And I think that's the path forward. I mean, I see this movement. I mean, anything in politics takes a long time. I mean, look at Anthony Albanese. He's been in Parliament for 30 years, and he's finally got the role of Prime Minister. I mean, I think a lot of us are in our infancy, and I think when we look back in 10, 20 years' time, we're going to be going, oh, wow, we achieved a lot, but it might not seem that way right now because we're so focused, we're living in it, we've got those blinders on. But I think there's definitely something swirling around. There's a lot of good people out there, and they're slowly coming together. And I think, in the future, we're going to be seeing the fruits of that play out.
Yeah, I think so as well. And look, as someone who experienced it firsthand, when you do put your head up, they do like to smack you back down. So you learn your lesson. And the point is, you just need to keep going. I learned that lesson the hard way. And I think, putting yourself out there, whether it's through independent media like this, going on podcasts, can be difficult, particularly when there's a live comment feed and people coming in and giving their 2 cents. But, at the end of the day, everyone's entitled to their opinion, and everyone's welcome to be part of the discussion. We're not going to get along with everyone. We're not going to agree with everything. The point is to be talking. And I think for so long, particularly during the COVID years, we weren't talking. It was accept this news story, accept these statistics, accept, what the government of the day was saying, and shut up. I mean, was it Jacinda Ardern famously said, "We will be your single source of truth," which just, even saying that now, it sends chills down my spine. I think what we need is more people having conversations. And yes, you're going to disagree, and there's going to be people who don't like you, but keep going anyway, and that's my hope for, particularly with Australian independent media. I've seen people on the other side of the aisle, like Punters Politics, doing well, and I champion that. I disagree with him on a lot of things, but it's great to see someone build a platform and talk about things, because that's how we actually get back into that middle ground and start to see the country move forward again through really robust conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I've enjoyed the chat tonight, but right now we are up to the most important part of the show. And Carlz, that's called Build Your Own Fantasy Government. Now, you're going to be in charge in the next Parliament of Australia, and you can choose 5 or 6 people. They can be living or dead. They don't have to be politicians. But the idea is to choose 5 or 6 people that will lead Australia into the right direction for the next Parliament. You're in complete control. Who do you choose?
Oof, can I steal someone that's in Parliament over on the other side of the world?
Yes, of course. Anyone you choose.
Look, I feel like my first one would be Javier Milei from Argentina. We need someone to come in and cut back the government. Our public service is completely bloated, and we need to save some money. And we need to do that by dismantling sections of government that are completely irrelevant. So that would be my first one. The second one would be Nayib Bukele, someone who can be hardline and make tough decisions. I find it really interesting. Everyone from the Oddcast will know this. I'm enamored with Nayib. I really appreciate.
I haven't heard that name before.
Oh, okay. So he's the current president of El Salvador, and I'll tell you this story very quickly. So El Salvador was the homicide capital of the world, right? Per capita, I think it was over 1,800 murders per 100,000. No, I'm going to get that wrong. I think it was 18 per 100,000 or something. It was an extraordinary rate of homicide. And it's because it was completely overrun by MS-13 and a couple of other crime gangs. And it was so bad, and obviously it was a very poor country, that children were recruited into these gangs. So it just was like, it just kept going. And Nayib won his election and had sweeping reform, and in 18 months was able to build CtN Center, which is the biggest prison system in the Southern American countries, and basically round them all up, humiliated all these gang members, and they're locked up for life. And now that has completely stripped back their homicide rates. I think it's like, one of the safest countries in the Americas now. And that was done in his first 2 years of government. And that's because he took a hardline approach.
This is why it's so frustrating. With good leadership, you can implement change quite quickly, and successful change. I mean, it can happen. Like, we're not in the pits forever, but we need good leadership like that. We're really searching for it at the moment in this country.
And again, I think a lot of what deters Australian political leaders from speaking up, have a look at what happened to Jacinda Price recently. When she made comments around the Indian community, they weren't even bad. But look at the backlash. Oh, that's so offensive. You can't say that. That's the culture Australians live in. Oh, you can't say hurty words. That's terrible.
Then her own party tells her to apologize and removes her from the front bench. It's like, where's the support? Where's the leadership? I mean, you got to stand for your convictions. I mean, it blows
that
my
sets
mind.
the precedent, does it? Step out of line and you lose your job, you lose your career, you lose your voice. And that's my frustration. So, and I think the next person I'd add to the government would be Pauline Hanson. I think she's a staunch nationalist in the best way. I think she truly does want what's good for this country. I'm not saying I agree with all her policies, but what you need are people in our government who are willing to make tough decisions in the face of some pushback. Anyone that steps into our government is going to cop some kind of spray from people on the other side of the political aisle. That's to be expected. But what you need are people who are tough, people who can make a decision and not have to feel like they need to bend the knee or kiss the ring of a small minority that are really vocal.
Yeah, definitely.
And I've got one more.
Yeah, you've given us 3.
3.
So it can be as many as you like, really. But
okay, 2 more. I would take. Who would I steal? I know everyone wants me to say Trump. I wouldn't steal Trump because I think Trump needs to be in the US, right?
Yeah.
I don't think we need him in Australia. I think he needs to be in the US doing what he's doing over there. I might take a JD Vance, right? Or
Yes.
a Donald Trump Jr., right? We need
Yep.
someone in our government who has a sense of humor. We need
You know
someone.
what? It's a good pick because I said a few months ago that all the Liberal Party people should be modelling themselves on JD Vance. That's my
Agree.
opinion. I mean, I think
Yeah.
they should look to him and go, "That's the future of politics, at least here in this country." But they never will. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know who they look to.
I think, when it comes to politics, a sense of humor is important because it kind of dismantles all of this super heavy weighted conversation, right? If you can't laugh at yourself and you can't appreciate that someone's going to make a meme about you, well, then maybe you're not right for the top jobs. JD Vance is a great troll, and I actually think that's a really endearing asset to have because when you're talking about some really heavy things, that humor is what binds us together. The fact that people aren't willing to have conversations and are super offended by everything makes it impossible to have these conversations. I made that comment about in Victoria we can't talk about youth crime because it's racially loaded. Well, if you can't have can't joke about some things and have some dark humor, I don't know how we're ever going to get to the point where we have the real conversation. Because it's also taboo, right? So I think a JD Vance would be very important as well, just to lighten the air a little bit.
No, I agree completely. Well, look, thank you for coming on tonight. Is Instagram the best place to follow you to keep up to date with everything you're doing?
Instagram for me personally, so it's just at Carlz Soda. I do have X as well, but X is where I do all my more political takes. But over on my Instagram, I'm doing a lot of sort of videos now about cultural phenomenons and the way that we're approaching things. So if that interests you guys, head on over there. But otherwise, you can check us out on the podcast, which is the Oddcast HQ. We do a live show every Monday at 7:30. 7:30. And then every Wednesday at 7 p.m. is the actual podcast itself. But yeah, I mean, I just want to encourage more and more people to get on board independent media like this, support each other, like everyone's pages, leave some comments, share their shows. That, I think, is ultimately the best way forward for Aussies, right?
Yeah,
Just
I
open
agree
up
completely.
conversation.
Yep.
Yeah.
And thank you for allowing us to share this on your platform. And thank you for coming on. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been a pleasure. So hopefully I can get you on at some point in the future as well. We can do it all again.
Yeah, no worries, mate. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely. And everyone watching, thank you for watching. I mean, please share this out. We do rely on the audience to get this stuff out there. So, send it out to whoever you might, friends and family, or even your enemies, or your friends or foes, as they say. Share it around. And thank you for joining us tonight. We'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.